There were furious arguments in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, when members debated a bill setting up an inquiry into the funding of human rights and other NGOs. That was Deputy Foreign Minister Danny Ayalon struggling to be heard before a vote that brought the inquiry another step closer. And the anger of the debate is reflected in today's newspaper headlines. When did it become illegal to be a leftist in Israel, asks one commentator in the left-of-centre Haaretz newspaper, while another says it's nothing to do with left and right, it's about protecting the state of Israel. Well, how exactly? Haggai Elad is Executive Director of the Association of Civil Rights in Israel. He's based in Tel Aviv. First, though, Professor Gerald Steinberg of the group NGO Monitor.
There is a problem. There is a serious political war going on against Israel. It parallels the terrorism. It parallels 62 years of trying to wipe Israel off the map. It was declared in the Durban Conference of 2001 the goal of isolating Israel internationally through false claims of human rights violations, of war crimes, and organizations that claim to have a human rights agenda are leading this process. We see it in the Goldstone report. We see it in many other ways in the attempts to label Israeli leaders, including the head of the opposition, Tzipi Livni, as war criminals in the UK. This is a very broad and very problematic issue.
What is your evidence for saying this is a war? You're making it sound as if it's a concerted thing, somehow orchestrated by someone.
Oh, clearly. In the Durban NGO Forum, there are 1,500 organizations that participated in this in 2001. They clearly stated the goal is to internationally isolate Israel and to turn Israel into an apartheid state through these false claims. This is not something that's made up. The language is very clear, and there's a lot of money going into it, and that's the issue here.
You think that all NGOs in Israel are doing this?
Of course not. And I think we should be very careful not to make absurd statements, not to use terms like McCarthyism, to look at the substance. This is not, it should not be an ideological issue. And what's happened is that there's such a great deal of concern in Israel over the abuse of human rights. These are all anti-human rights activities. And I'm sure we'll hear some of this also in opposition from Haggai Elad when he speaks, because legitimate organizations that really are concerned about human rights stay away from this kind of a process. But it has become a political issue in Israel, and it has therefore been used in the Knesset to set up an inquiry. We're not talking about banning, or the language of, again, of this extreme language of saying this is some form of McCarthyism is really an attack on democracy. What's really happening here is that a lot of the funding is secret. We don't know how the processes work. Europe provides a great deal. European governments and even the ministers don't know about this. So the attempt to find out how this very much declared war is taking place.
Okay.
Who enables it is an important issue. Whether the parliamentary inquiry is the best way to go about doing this, I just want to say that if Europe would make this information available, if European governments would be transparent as they're required to democratically, there would not be a need for any kind of Israeli response.
Let's get a response from Haggai Elad on this question of funding and the war against Israel being waged by various groups, according to Professor Steinberg. What is your response to that?
Yeah, I think the real war that is happening here is the war against Israeli democracy that is being waged by the initiators of such proposals and many others, as we've been struggling with over the past year and more than that. And actually, I welcome the invitation to talk about substance, and I also happen to agree that there's a lot of secrecy around foreign funding coming into Israel. But the point is, if this wasn't McCarthyism, then it would have been really about transparency. The facts, the substance are that the foreign funding coming from foreign friendly democracies, the EU and other countries, is actually already transparent. The only arena where secrecy actually exists in the context of foreign funding is with regard to private funding that is coming from abroad in supporting a wide range of extreme right agendas like settler NGOs in East Jerusalem and in other places.
So why, Haggai Elad, do you think that NGOs are being singled out, like including yours, in this way?
Yeah, I think we're singled out because we are effective. And this is part of a broader effort to confuse between legitimate criticism of government policies. Israel is now being led by the most anti-democratic government that we've seen in decades, if not since 1948. And we have plenty of criticism of government policies with regard to the state of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories, with regard to the situation of the 20% of Israelis who are Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel, and so on and so forth. And the attempt here is to confuse between such criticism and delegitimizing the state of Israel.
Gerald Steinberg, can you answer that? Demonizing legitimate criticism of Israel and its government and activities?
The claim that this is somehow anti-democratic, that a democratically elected parliament is acting anti-democratically, and that self-promoting organizations, largely funded by foreign governments in secretive ways, and unfortunately Haggai Elad does not know the details, because if he did, he would know that there are no protocols, there are no documents for 15 years, and we're talking about $100 million or euros a year coming from European governments, and yet there is no information on how this process takes place. So there's no transparency, and actually this lack of democracy, it comes from Europe. And the Israeli Knesset, the democratically elected Knesset, through a very open process, as Haggai Elad certainly knows, should not be trashed in the way of calling them anti-democratic.
But the problem
That's simply
is
ideological slogans, and we should be a little bit more mature about the discussion.
The problem is, Professor Steinberg, that this does come after a number of incidents involving, we call them left-of-centre activists, people who have been arrested for doing things like a woman praying at the Western Wall was arrested. We've had various people arrested for peaceful demonstrations. The New Israel Fund being investigated. Its president, a former MK, Naomi Chazan, coming under particular investigation. There have been a number of incidents which are perceived as attacks on the left, where people demonstrating in similar ways on the right have not been targeted.
The big problem here is the language that's being used and the huge overstatement. There's no investigation of the New Israel Fund. What there is long overdue criticism and debate. When I learned about democracy, I learned that debate is extremely important, that criticism is legitimate. What these organizations are saying is we are holy. We should never be criticized. We should never be looked at in any kind of detail, that everything that we do should be considered to be some sort of purity of human rights and morality. If, on the other hand, we find that they are acting in immoral ways, that's called illegitimate criticism. That's called McCarthyism. The language has become extreme, and the language is very, in itself, anti-democratic. Let's have a proper debate.
Okay.
That's not illegitimate. It is extremely important.
I want to get a response to that from Haggai Elad.
What has happened yesterday is that we've moved from pushing Israeli democracy down the slippery slope into a free fall stage. For the first time, independent, non-governmental organizations in a country that, and last time I checked, was still defined as democracy, are going to be investigated through the tyranny of the majority, of the current majority in parliament, where there is no substantial evidence for nothing. And if there was, then I would recommend people that have such evidence to just, approach the police and lead an investigation. But there's no substance to all of these allegations besides this hype.
Okay.
The attack is not an attack on the left, it's an attack on Israeli democracy. And the irony is that much of the concern that, as if funneling this, is a concern about Israel's image abroad that is somehow damaged by the actions of human rights organizations. Much of Israel's international credibility still stands exactly because such organizations such as ACRI and others are still able to function freely in Israel.
And that's Haggai Elad of ACRI, the Association of Civil Rights in Israel. And I was speaking also to Professor Gerald Steinberg of NGO Monitor.